Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about anime today. It is Code Geass, Lelouch of the Rebellion. Just season 1 today because there's a lot more other stuff going on with season 2, so I'll do a separate video on that. This is a series that came out back in 2006, I think, and was recommended to me by, I think, Bradford Walker, but it might have been Brian Niemeyer. Anyway, it's a mecha anime, but trust me, you do not have to be into mecha anime in order to enjoy this series, and that's because most of the focus is on the characters and the drama between the characters, and most importantly, some themes that are expressed through character conflict, mainly the conflict between trying to achieve a particular end with maybe means that are unpleasant and trying to achieve that end using, quote, the proper means all the way through. And that conflict is expressed between the two main characters, the protagonist Lelouch and his best friend Suzuku. Each of them has a different worldview on the ends versus the means conflict, and they express it through their actions, through their plans. And so that's the main thing that I think draws a lot of the interest. But there's also really great world building, a definitive art style that maybe is not my preference, but is nonetheless pretty good to look at, and some great plotting as well. So let me go through some of the other categories before I dig a little bit deeper into the story analysis. So before I get into the story analysis, let me talk a little bit about some production elements and things like that. So first of all, I'm not a huge fan of the character designs for Code Geass. It did not stop me from enjoying the anime, however. And the reason I'm not a big fan of them is that they are too far on the side of exaggerated for my liking. So this is a really common thing with both manga and anime, and that is to have characters that have very exaggerated body proportions. I don't mean like overly large breasts or something like that. What I mean is the proportion of the head to the rest of the body tends to be 9 heads plus in some manga and anime. And if you aren't an art student or you've never studied this, a typical person has like they're like 7 heads tall, let's say. And a very heroic person is going to be like 8 or 9 heads tall. So manga tends to have taller looking characters. Their head is smaller in proportion to their body, which makes them look more fashionable, more heroic, more robust. Well, this one takes it, I think, a little bit too much of an extreme. It's like they're like 10 head characters, but they're also very skinny and tend to have some exaggerated hand sizes, breast sizes, and say tapering of the sleeves of the on the arms, the sleeves, and the pant legs. So it looks almost like a cartoonish style from the late 70s or early 80s, and maybe that's what you like, but to me, it just wasn't really my favorite. Didn't stop me from enjoying it completely. I didn't dislike the character design so much that I didn't want to watch it or anything like that. They were just a little bit too far on the exaggerated side. Likewise, the eye proportions tend to be a little bit oversized. Everything tends to be a little bit more cartoonish than maybe similar anime. So that's my criticism of that. Now, the mech designs I found generally pretty interesting. The mechs are smaller maybe than other mecha anime. Rather than being like kaiju-sized mechs, they're like tank-sized mechs. And that's because they are used as kind of an expression of knightly combat or samurai type of combat. They're smaller. They're more agile. They tend to move in different ways rather than walking. They use like wheels that move around. But the mech designs, I think, are generally functional. And one of the things that I liked about the mech designs is, and this actually spills over into season 2, is as you go further along, the more advanced the mech is, basically the cooler it looks. So the old mechs, they call them nightmares in this. The old mechs look, like pretty basic stompy mech robots. And as you get more advanced, then they start to look more like advanced Gundam robots. They have fins and stuff sticking out, and they look more baroque and more detailed. And then the weapons power up. So you have this kind of power up curve, which happens in some of these series, is where things get stronger. They do it in a really convincing way, but also the mech designs get more interesting. So basically if a mech is really good because it looks really cool, rather than it being a very plain looking mech. So there's really standard mechs that are just kind of gray or purple, and then the really cool ones that have a lot of different colors and fins, and the say the cockpit of it begins to look more and more like a face as you go further along in the series. So that was kind of interesting, and I appreciated those designs. And those designs do cue into the world building. So let me go ahead and transfer over. I'll leave most of the production behind. Actually, let me type a few more things. The music I like. The music soundtrack basically uses a lot of small orchestrations, like maybe a single trumpet. There's a lot of little jazz tunes in there, but there's a lot of atonal figures that really work well, I think, to set the mood. So the music is kind of subdued and kind of scaled down. Rather than a big orchestra, it sounds like you have a small ensemble most of the time. But those single instruments are really put to good effect. A lot of little trumpet solos, little things like that pop in here and out. But the music always matches what's going on. If there's an action scene, you tend to get a lot more, a lot fuller sound with more percussive elements that match the mood really well. So it's one of those things where I really noticed the music in the more dramatic sections really matching well. And again, use of atonal figures that are not strictly melodic in order to provoke that mood and kind of get out of the way. They're not really memorable, but that's not the point. The point is to enhance the mood of the scene. And so that they work really well. I'll talk about acting in the story section. So the story, let's talk about the world building. This is an alternate history, basically, but alternate future of an alternate history. And one of the things I like about maybe alternate history or alternate versions of our world is that you have a great mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar. So everything seems kind of interesting. The basis of this anime is that you have this large empire, the Britannian Empire, that has spread out over the globe and has conquered Japan. So this is going to be analogous to the British Empire. So it's like the British Empire never went away. World War I and World War II were different, but we don't know quite all that backstory. We just know that there's this worldwide empire, and they're marginally resisted by an EU, a European Union of some kind, and then a powerful Chinese government. And the Chinese government is kind of interesting. They're expressed through, I guess, what I might call caricatures of Chinese culture. So rather than being communist China, it's like the imperial Chinese system never went away. So we're talking about an alternate history that basically discards the Chinese Revolution. So the ambassadors to the Britannian Empire, some of them are eunuchs. Other ones have, wear traditional Chinese warrior attire and conduct themselves in a traditional Chinese manner. And so they're kind of, I use the word caricatures, but they're highly representative of the older style of Chinese culture that was mostly either wiped away or changed during the Communist Revolution and the Cultural Revolution, which followed it. So I found that very interesting, and we didn't really get to see much of the Europeans in season 1, but that's okay. Now, what I find very interesting is they basically give you a rundown of what has already happened at the beginning of the movie to kind of set the tone for this alternate future, alternate history, where Japan has been conquered by Britannia using the power of these nightmares, these mechs. And once they conquer Japan, they basically annex it into their empire and forbid even the mention of the name of Japan. Rather, it's called District 11, and the people inside are not allowed to call themselves Japanese or Nihonji. They are called 11s. They're just called a number. So their ethnicity is relegated down to a number, and they are second-class citizens. They're not allowed basically to hold public office or to have any meaningful place in society. Rather, it's Britannians, it's British people who've come in and taken over, and they basically are the entire upper crust of the society that's occupying Japan, with all of the Japanese people on the bottom. There's still a very strong Japanese ethnic sentiment that's present, and there's an ongoing Japanese rebellion. The Japanese rebels, kind of parallel to the Chinese, the Japanese rebels represent traditional Japanese warrior virtues and traditional Japanese culture, say prior to World War II, or I'm not going to say like prior to the Meiji Restoration, but the values that were that we would typically associate with Japan from the Middle Ages all the way through to the pre-war period. So that's what's represented in Japan. And I found this really interesting because every little detail, there's like some big backstory to it, and it makes the whole universe feel very alive and very interesting. So it's not always that I'm really interested in the entire setting. I really just kind of want to get through plot, but the setting was very, very interesting as a result. And because that setting was both familiar and unfamiliar, you get a lot of possibilities with the plot that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were sticking to something that was a little bit easier to define. And as an audience member, I'm trying to predict what might happen, and I found myself often wrong, which was great. There were surprises, there were failures of different characters to achieve their goals, which makes you feel like the whole time that you don't really know what's going to happen. And that's something that I've been missing from a lot of stories, is the feeling that things could turn out different from how I want them to turn out, or different from how I expect them to turn out. And there was a lot of things that happened that I didn't expect to happen in that first season, and I really did appreciate that. And I think a lot of it had to do with that core world building, which was so interesting. Next, so that's setting. Let's talk about characters. I think the big strength of Code Geass is the characters. The characters are really strong. They're very well defined, and they do a really good job of defining the characters very quickly and efficiently early on in the series, so they can act and be going through the plot very well. So the two main characters are Lelouch. Lelouch is secretly the son of the Britannian Emperor. The Britannian Emperor has many children with different wives. So I can't tell yet if there's like some sort of polygamy there, or if it's just serial monogamy. Like he has a wife, divorces, or that wife dies and gets the next one. But he has a lot of kids, and all the kids are princes and princesses and take part in the government, or governors of various areas in the empire. But he is secretly a son because his mother died, and basically he ended up on the outs of the entire system. So he has a strong desire for revenge against his father, who basically outcast him during the time of this Japanese revolution, or I shouldn't say Japanese conquest, rather. So that's Lelouch. And so his main drive is to destroy the Britannian Empire, and especially to overthrow his father, who he views it as a corrupt and evil system run by corrupt and evil people. And of course, he has a strong desire for revenge. The main contrast to him is his best friend Suzaku, who he grew up with in Japan and is actually the son of the last Japanese prime minister. And Suzaku, who is Japanese, would normally be a second-class citizen, but he is a soldier in the Britannian Empire because of his contrast. He represents basically the opposite viewpoint of Lelouch. Lelouch is the classic revolutionary. He wants to destroy the system and replace it with something else. He's also the character that represents the belief that the end justifies the means, that, you know, if the end doesn't justify the means, what does? Or if we want to achieve our goal, we may have to do things that are unpleasant. We may have to make sacrifices of people or ideas that we don't want to do along the way, but are necessary to achieve victory. Versus Suzaku, who is the reformer, the classical reformer, wants to change the system from within, believes that the means are more important than the ends, that if you achieve an end with bad means, then it's like you really haven't achieved anything. So those two characters, who are best friends, are basically set against each other as a kind of contrast. They're also within physical contrast. Lelouch is a genius, is a mental genius, but is physically weak. He's not very athletic. Any of the endeavors that he has to go through where he has to exert himself physically, he gets tired very easily. Suzaku, however, is very athletic. He's very charming, very upfront, very likable. Lelouch is very subtle. He's very brooding. He's very kind of aloof from his peers. And so the contrast between those two characters really sets up the drama that exists between them. And what happens early on, as I kind of transition into plot, I can't really separate these two, is that Lelouch is given a special secret power. This isn't a big spoiler. This happens really in the first episode. But I don't want to get too deep into it before I get into an area where I'm talking about plot, and I'll be revealing spoilers to show how things resolve. But he gets a special power that lets him control the mind of others and make them do things. But only once. He can only do it one time per person. And he's given this power by some being from another world that we don't really learn everything about in this first season. They set this up because this basically creates the rules of the game. The series opens up with Lelouch playing chess and winning chess, showing that he's a strategic genius, even though he's physically weak, and giving him a power that he can use strategically to achieve his aims. Suzuku, on the other hand, is a pilot of one of these nightmares, a very advanced one. He's athletic, he's charming, he's straightforward, and he tends to be a more, I guess, extroverted character in that sense. And he's not really concerned with strategy. He's concerned with other matters, things that are honor, things that have to do with doing the right thing. And he's always concerned with the process costs of doing things. I don't want to have a rebellion as the time goes on. I don't want to have a rebellion or revolution because many people will suffer as a result of it. And it'd be better if we could change things from within so less people suffer. Again, the classic contrast between the revolutionary and the reformer. The person who wants to reform, the person who wants to sweep away the old system and replace it. Now, the supporting cast of characters are all pretty interesting. I don't need to go through every single one, but a lot of them fit very nicely into some of these archetypes. Suzuku's kind of a goody two-shoes because he's the reformer. You don't really have any kind of shrew characters. You have a character that's somewhat of a shrew. You have more of aloof characters. You have characters that are kind of classic nerds. You have the best friend kind of character that kind of tags along with everybody and is mostly a supporting character. You have a good little cast, and they define themselves very quickly. Now, as things go on, transferring into the plot area, as things go on, you learn more about some of the characters, and you also get a lot of reveals about not just how the world works, but the backgrounds of certain characters and how those two ideas, the end justifies the means and the end doesn't justify the means, are really challenged within those two main characters. So the focus of everything is really the drama between those two main characters. So for one thing, Lelouch is forced to make sacrifices that cause him pain and are not pleasant for him. He has to sacrifice people in battles, which is part of strategy. He has to deal with the fact that people that look to him for guidance have ended up dead or hurt. But also there's a point at which he has to use his power on a girl who is in love with him. And he has to use his power to make her forget about him because she's witnessed all these things about his power. He has at this point, he's taken on a secret identity called Zero. Now, from this point forward, there's going to be spoilers, so just deal with it, or you can turn it off and go watch the series. And so he has to deal with the very unfortunate and sad thing that somebody he really cares about, he has to use his power on and basically harm them and also take something away from himself. He loses a close friend and somebody that he really cared about and somebody who really cared about him. He's erasing her feelings for him, and that's a really powerful moment for him where he realizes that the game that he's decided to play, this game of revenge and revolution, is really going to cost him a lot. And towards the end of the series, that gets challenged in a much more profound way, and he basically, again, I'm talking about spoilers, he will fail that challenge because the challenge is he willing to sacrifice his sister? He has a sister who's been disabled, blind, and in a wheelchair, and he really loves her. Will he be willing to sacrifice her for the sake of the revolution? And it's just too much for him. He can't make that sacrifice. Meanwhile, Suzuku, on the other hand, you think that he's a very straightforward, goody two-shoes kind of character, but it gets revealed that he actually killed his father. And he killed his father in order to basically prevent a continued resistance of the Japanese people against the Britannians because so many people will die. As he was so concerned about the process costs, he actually did something really bad as he murdered his own father. And this haunts him and it affects him in very big ways. And there's a point at which Lelouch, who Suzuku doesn't know who Lelouch really is until the very end of the series, Lelouch figures out what happened to Suzuku and what actually he did. And this becomes a a personal reflective challenge for Shizuku and alters his character when he has to confront the reality of what he's done in the past. That he can't be this kind of goody two-shoes character that really cares about the process costs because he has sacrificed big things along the way as well. And moving into the second season, which I'm not going to talk about in this one, you start to see these two positions get muddled and confused, and the characters have to really deal with the problems of trying to stick to one single path within these two big paradigms. In general, this first season, the plot plays out pretty well. There's failures. Lelouch fails and succeeds at various times throughout the series. Lelouch encounters surprises that set him back. And what I really liked about the way they set up the plot is they set up all the rules in the first episode. And Shizuku, being a chess player, quickly figures out what the limits are of his new power are. This being that he saves, kind of almost by accident, gives him this power to control people so that he can strategize his revolution. And what ends up happening is that he has to figure out the rules of that, and he does it very quickly. So you have like a rule set for how the characters can operate. You have, that kind of goes into the setting. It helps you figure out what sort of plot's going to happen. And as things go through, sometimes those rules, he figures out that they're different from how they are, or he encounters another character who has the power but doesn't have the same rule set, and he has to outthink him. And there's some real good tense moments that arise from that, and sometimes some big surprises where you think he's won in one time, but he hasn't. He has to rethink what he's doing. And then when you finally get to the end, there's a very, very sudden break of the rules, and I think the writers pay for this in a great way, which is that normally he can control when he uses his power. He suddenly loses that control and accidentally controls one of his sisters, not his full sister, but a half sister, a fellow sibling of this Britannian emperor, and ends up telling her things which are unconscionable and causes an absolutely horrible massacre and tragedy and a complete destruction of this character, of this girl, his sister's memory, and everybody's belief of who she was basically crumbles because of this action that he unintentionally makes her do. And so again, the character really pays hard for his belief that there's going to be sacrifices made along the way, even though what he did ended up pushing his, basically pushed his goals of the revolution a little bit further. It was through means that he really detested and did not want to go through anyway. He didn't intend to make the sacrifice, but it happened, and lots of people died as a result, and he has to deal with the psychic fallout from that. So that's the plot, character setting plot. The whole thing works really, really good together. I could talk much longer if I wanted to talk about every single little character. There's like a scientist character. There's two scientist characters that are opposed to each other, representing different character dynamics. One which is very serious, one which is a lot more kind of silly and flippant about what he's doing. Lots of these setups of characters that are in high contrast to each other. A very socially awkward character with a very extroverted character. A character who really cares about what people think. A character who doesn't care about what people think. There's even a character that basically is a lesbian and falls in love with this princess and has a psychic crisis when this princess turns out to do evil things. Now, she's been mind controlled to do evil things, but it causes major fallout for some of the characters involved. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. I really enjoyed the first season, and I think it's some great writing, and maybe you'll enjoy it. Not a huge fan of the character designs, but it didn't stop me from enjoying the series. So check it out, Code Geass, Lelouch of the Rebellion, Season 1. I'll talk about Season 2 in another video because it goes completely bonkers and starts to do way crazier stuff. So we're kind of like this in the first season. In Season 2, it's the limits just get pushed way out, and so you get a lot different kinds of stories in Season 2. So I enjoyed it, and maybe you'll enjoy it too. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Newest books, Keys to Prolific Creativity from last year, how to have a creative process that works in your busy life so that you can complete your projects on time, under budget, get your books published, get your music published, get it out there. And of course, where is it? Krampus Christmas is still available through the end of the month. This is a big collection. It has a bunch of my books in it and some new ones as well, some new novellas that you probably haven't read before, and one you certainly haven't read before because it's never been published in any form prior to this one. So check that out, and I will see you guys next time. Don't forget to visit my website, dvspress.com, if you want kind of things that are maybe not, things that are just a little bit outside of what I normally do on YouTube. Okay, so thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.